There's no pain quite like a mother's heart when her child goes missing. For weeks, an elderly woman searched the frozen mountains of Montana Territory, fearing the worst with each passing day. When she finally finds her daughter alive in a stranger's cabin, relief floods through her, until she hears one word that stops her cold. Husband. Her daughter is calling this mountain man her husband. The mother's shock turns to fury. She demands answers. How did this happen? The mountain man stays calm and begins to speak. But before we hear what he has to say, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What could he possibly say to make this right? The cabin door stood open against the winter cold, as if someone had fled in haste or arrived in fury. Margaret Hayes gripped the frame with one trembling hand, her breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with the climb up the mountain trail. Inside, her daughter Sarah stood beside a man Margaret had never seen before, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with weathered skin and eyes that held the kind of calm that comes from years of solitude. Margaret's leather satchel slipped from her shoulder and hit the wooden floor with a thud. Inside were Sarah's childhood belongings, a rag doll, a hair ribbon, a small wooden horse her father had carved before he died. Margaret had carried these items for 3 weeks, clutching them like talismans as she'd searched every town, every trading post, every remote settlement between Helena and the wilderness beyond. "Mama," Sarah whispered, and the word broke something inside Margaret's chest. But then Sarah's hand moved, reaching for the man beside her, and Margaret saw it. A simple band of carved wood circling her daughter's finger, the kind of ring a frontier man might make when there was no jeweler for 100 miles, no church, no proper ceremony, just a promise carved into pine. "Why does my daughter call you husband?" Margaret's voice came out harsh, loud enough to echo off the log walls. The man didn't flinch. He stood there in his worn buckskin jacket and homespun shirt, his hands relaxed at his sides. No guilt in his posture. No shame. Just a quiet readiness, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation and had already made peace with whatever came next. "My name is Jacob Stone, Mom," he said, his voice low and steady. "And I can explain everything if you'll give me the chance." Margaret's eyes swept the cabin, taking in every detail with the sharp attention of a woman looking for evidence of wrongdoing. The space was small, but scrupulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clear of ash. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, sage, yarrow, feverfew. A rough-hewn table held a water basin and a stack of clean cloths. In the corner, a narrow bed was made with military precision, a faded quilt folded at its foot. 2 plates sat on the table, 2 cups, 2 chairs. Where had this man been sleeping? Sarah took a tentative step forward. She moved carefully, as if her body still remembered pain. Margaret noticed the slight hitch in her daughter's gait, the way she kept one hand pressed to her ribs beneath the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Mama, please," Sarah said. "You don't understand what happened." "Then make me understand." Margaret's voice cracked. "I've spent 3 weeks believing you were dead, 3 weeks following cold trails and empty rumors. The wagon master in Coppersville told me your train was attacked. He said there were bodies. He said—" She couldn't finish, couldn't speak the words she'd been holding in her throat like stones. Jacob moved then, pulling out one of the chairs. "Sit down, Mrs. Hayes. Please. You've come a long way." Margaret wanted to refuse, wanted to grab her daughter and run, but her legs were shaking from the climb. from the weeks of walking and riding and sleeping in boarding houses that smelled of tobacco and despair. She sank into the chair, her hands gripping its edge. Jacob pulled out the second chair and sat across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. Sarah remained standing, positioned between them like a bridge neither could cross without her permission. "I found your daughter 3 weeks ago," Jacob began, "near Copper Ridge, about 15 miles south of here. There'd been an ambush on the wagon train she was traveling with. By the time I got there, the bandits were gone and most of the survivors had fled. Sarah was in a ravine, unconscious and bleeding." Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. "She had a head wound," Jacob continued, his tone matter-of-fact, but not unkind. "Broken ribs. Her clothes were torn. She'd been thrown from the wagon during the attack and rolled down the slope. If she'd stayed there another hour, she would have frozen to death." The room seemed to tilt. Margaret looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and saw what she'd been too angry to notice before. The fading bruise along her daughter's temple, the careful way she held herself, the pallor beneath her skin that spoke of recent illness. "The nearest town was 3 days' ride," Jacob said. "And a blizzard was coming. I could see it in the clouds, smell it in the air. I had to make a choice, try to get her to a doctor and likely lose her to exposure and fever on the trail, or bring her here where I had shelter, heat, and medicine." "Medicine?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Jacob stood and walked to a shelf above the fireplace. He took down a leather bundle tied with sinew and set it on the table between them. When he opened it, Margaret saw dried herbs, roots, strips of willow bark, small clay pots sealed with wax. "I learned from a Crow medicine woman years back," he said. "After my wife died, I spent time with her people. They taught me how to heal wounds, how to break fevers, how to keep someone alive when there's no doctor for miles around." Margaret stared at the bundle, at the careful organization of it, at the evidence of knowledge passed down through generations. "Your daughter was delirious for 3 days, Jacob said quietly. "Didn't know her own name. Didn't know where she was. I kept her warm, gave her willow bark tea for the pain, changed her bandages, slept on the floor so she could have the bed." Sarah's voice joined his, soft but firm. "He saved my life, Mama. He was always respectful. Always proper." Margaret's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. "Then why?" She looked at the wooden ring on her daughter's finger. "Why this?" Jacob sat back down, and for the first time, something flickered across his face. Not quite discomfort, but a recognition of the complexity they were navigating. "That was later," he said, "after she started to heal." Sarah moved closer, kneeling beside her mother's chair. "Mama, when I woke up, I didn't remember you at first. Didn't remember Helena or home or anything before the ambush. I thought everyone was dead. I thought I was alone in the world." Margaret's hand found her daughter's, gripping it tight. "By the time my memory came back, I'd been here almost 2 weeks," Sarah continued. "And the weather. Mama, you can't imagine the snow. The cabin was buried. The trails were impassable. Even if Jacob had wanted to take me to town, we couldn't leave." 2 weeks, Margaret repeated, and she understood. 2 weeks of an unmarried woman living alone with a man in the wilderness. 2 weeks that would destroy Sarah's reputation if anyone knew. 2 weeks that would mark her as ruined, unsuitable for marriage, unsuitable for anything but scandal and whispers. "It was my idea," Sarah said, and her voice carried a strength Margaret had never heard before. "I asked him to marry me. I asked him to let me stay." Jacob's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes held something Margaret couldn't quite name. Respect, perhaps, or a kind of weary acceptance of the harsh rules that governed frontier life. I told her no at first, he said. Told her she should wait, that her people would come looking, that she didn't need to tie herself to a stranger out of fear or gratitude. But I insisted, Sarah said, because I knew what would happen if I went back unmarried after living here. I knew what people would say, what they'd think, and I knew— She paused, swallowing hard. I knew I didn't want to go back to Helena anyway. There was nothing for me there. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Nothing there. As if everything Margaret had worked for, everything she'd sacrificed to keep them fed and housed after her husband died, counted for nothing. Jacob must have seen the pain on her face, because his voice softened. She spoke of you often, Mrs. Hayes. Told me about your sewing business, about how hard you worked. She loves you. That was never in question. Then why didn't she want to come home? Margaret's voice broke on the last word. Sarah's hand tightened around her mother's. Because home was just survival, Mama. Here I have a future. Jacob stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner. He opened it and pulled out a folded document, bringing it back to the table. He spread it out carefully, smoothing the creases. It was a land deed. Margaret saw the official seal, the careful script documenting 160 acres claimed under the Homestead Act. Jacob Stone's name was written at the top. This land is mine by law, Jacob said. I've worked it for 3 years, built this cabin with my own hands, planted crops, raised a few head of cattle. Come spring, I'll have proved it up and it'll be mine, free and clear. He paused, his finger tracing the edge of the document. When I married your daughter, half of it became hers. By law. That's not nothing, Mrs. Hayes. That's security. That's a future no town could offer her. Margaret stared at the deed, at the promise of land and legitimacy it represented. Her mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the anger she'd carried up the mountain with the reality sitting before her. This wasn't a drifter who'd taken advantage of her daughter. This was a homesteader, a man with property and skills and a code of honor that had saved Sarah's life. But he was still a stranger. Still a man her daughter had known for mere weeks before speaking vows that would bind her for life. I need time, Margaret said finally. I need to think. Jacob nodded. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. There's food enough and space enough. I'll sleep in the barn loft while you're here. No, Sarah said quickly. Mama can have the bed. She glanced at Jacob, something unspoken passing between them. Your daughter and I have been sleeping in shifts, Jacob said, addressing Margaret's unasked question. I take the bed for a few hours while she keeps the fire going, then we switch. It's practical, and it's proper. Margaret looked between them, seeing the careful distance they maintained, the respect in how they spoke to each other. Not love. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But something solid. Something real. The wooden ring on Sarah's finger caught the firelight, gleaming softly. Margaret thought of her own wedding band, sold 2 years ago to pay for her husband's burial. Thought of the choices women made when options were few and mercy was scarce. Tell me everything, she said, her voice steadier now. From the beginning. I want to hear it all. Jacob met her eyes, and in his gaze, Margaret saw patience. Yes, Ma'am, he said. You deserve that much. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, and Margaret Hayes settled in to hear the story of how her daughter became someone else's wife. Jacob walked to the corner of the cabin where a small trunk sat beneath a window. He knelt beside it, his movements deliberate, and lifted the lid. Margaret watched as he carefully removed a piece of torn canvas, folded and stained with something dark that could only be blood. When he brought it to the table, the fabric released a faint smell of gunpowder and pine sap. "This is what I cut from the wagon," Jacob said, spreading the canvas out. "After I found Sarah." Margaret leaned forward, her seamstress's eye immediately cataloguing the damage. 3 bullet holes, ragged and burned at the edges. Long tears where the canvas had been ripped, either by bullets or by desperate hands trying to escape. And blood, dried to a rust-brown color, splattered in patterns that spoke of violence and chaos. "Tell me what happened," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me everything you saw." Jacob settled back into his chair, his hands folding on the table. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much death in his lifetime. "It was 3 weeks back, early morning. I'd been tracking an elk herd up near Copper Ridge. That's about 15 miles south, rough country, lots of ravines and thick timber. I heard the gunfire around dawn. Multiple weapons, rapid fire. Knew right away it wasn't hunters." Sarah had moved to stand by the fireplace, her arms wrapped around herself. Margaret could see her daughter's face in profile, the way her jaw tightened at the memory. "By the time I got close enough to see what was happening, the attack was nearly over," Jacob continued. 4 men on horseback, armed with repeating rifles. They'd stopped a 3-wagon merchant train, killed the lead teamster before he could draw his weapon. The other drivers tried to fight back, but they were outgunned. "How many wagons?" Margaret asked. 3. 1 carrying dry goods and tools, 1 with flour and grain, 1 with passengers heading to Missoula. Jacob's eyes shifted to Sarah. "Your daughter was in the passenger wagon." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. "How many people?" 7 passengers total. When the shooting started, the driver tried to run the wagon off the trail, thinking he could lose the bandits in the trees. But one of the horses took a bullet and went down. The wagon flipped. Sarah's voice came soft from across the room. I remember the sound it made. Like the whole world was breaking apart. Jacob nodded. I was still a 1/4 mile out, working my way through the timber. By the time I had a clear line of sight, the bandits were already rifling through the wagons. I counted 3 bodies on the ground. The lead teamster, one of the passengers who'd tried to fight, and a woman who'd been thrown from the overturned wagon. Margaret's breath caught. "A woman? Older than your daughter. Maybe 40. She died on impact when the wagon rolled over her." Jacob's face remained impassive, but his eyes held an old sorrow. The other passengers scattered into the woods. The bandits let them go. They were more interested in the cargo than witnesses. They loaded up what they could carry and rode off, heading west. "You didn't try to stop them?" Margaret heard the accusation in her own voice and regretted it immediately. But Jacob didn't take offense. "I was one man with a hunting rifle against 4 men with repeaters and revolvers. I'm not a fool, Mrs. Hayes, and I'm not a hero. I waited until they were gone. Then I went looking for survivors." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "Found 2 of the teamsters alive, both wounded. One had taken a bullet in the shoulder, the other had a gash across his ribs from a knife. They were conscious enough to tell me what happened, to tell me there'd been passengers in the 3rd wagon. I helped bandage them up, told them to head for the nearest settlement once they could travel. And Sarah," Margaret's voice trembled. "I found her last." Jacob turned back to face them. The overturned wagon had come to rest at the edge of a ravine. When it flipped, she must have been thrown clear, probably saved her life. But she'd rolled down the slope, maybe 20 feet through rocks and deadfall. She was lying in a snow bank, half buried, not moving. Sarah's hand went to the side of her head, fingers touching the fading bruise at her temple. "I don't remember falling," she said quietly. "I remember the wagon tilting, remember screaming, then nothing until I woke up here." Jacob walked back to the table and sat down. I climbed down to her, checked for breathing. She was alive but unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. Her ribs were damaged. I could tell by how she was breathing, shallow and quick. Her lips were turning blue from the cold. He paused, and for the first time, Margaret saw something shift in his expression. Not quite emotion, but a crack in the steady calm he'd maintained. "I've seen men die from exposure in less time than she'd been lying there," he said. "Minutes matter in that kind of cold. I had to decide right then what to do." "Why didn't you take her to the Teamsters?" Margaret asked. "Surely they could have. They were wounded and barely able to care for themselves, and the nearest town was Coopersville, 3 days' hard ride through mountain passes that were already starting to snow." I looked at the sky. "Mrs. Hayes, I've lived in these mountains long enough to read weather. There was a blizzard coming, the kind that shuts down the passes for weeks." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to say there must have been another way. But she'd lived through Montana winters herself. She knew what the mountains could do when the snow came down in earnest. So I wrapped her in my coat, got her on my horse, and brought her here. Jacob's voice was flat, stating facts. "It took me 4 hours to get back, and by the time I did, she was burning with fever. The head wound had gotten infected, or maybe it was the exposure. Either way, she was in trouble." He reached across the table and pulled the medicine bundle closer. I cleaned the wound, stitched it closed with thread I'd boiled clean, wrapped her ribs tight to help them heal, made tea from willow bark and feverfew to bring down the fever and ease the pain. For 3 days, she was delirious, talking to people who weren't there, crying out in her sleep. Sarah moved away from the fireplace, coming to stand beside her mother's chair. "He sat with me," she said softly. "Even when I didn't know who he was or where I was, he kept talking to me, kept telling me I was safe." Margaret looked up at her daughter, seeing the gratitude in her eyes, the trust. "On the 4th day, the fever broke," Jacob said. "She woke up clear-headed, but she couldn't remember anything. Not her name, not where she'd come from, not the attack. I told her what I knew, showed her the torn canvas from the wagon, asked if any of it sounded familiar. It didn't, Sarah said. Not at first. It was like trying to remember someone else's life. But over the next few days, pieces came back, Jacob continued. She remembered Helena, remembered her mother, you, remembered that she'd been traveling to Missoula to find work. Margaret's throat tightened. You were running away. Sarah knelt beside her mother's chair again, taking Margaret's hands in her own. Not from you, Mama. Never from you. But after Papa died, I could see how hard it was. How much you struggled to keep us fed and housed. I wanted to help, wanted to earn money and send it back to you. I thought if I could find work in a bigger town. So you joined a wagon train without telling me. Margaret's voice broke. Sarah, I thought you were dead. When you didn't come home that night, when I found your room empty and your travel bag gone, She couldn't finish, couldn't speak past the knot of grief and anger and relief tangled in her chest. I left you a letter, Sarah whispered. On the kitchen table, didn't you find it? Margaret shook her head, tears finally spilling over. There was no letter. I searched everywhere. All I found was your father's horse carving on your pillow. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. Mrs. Brennan. She came by that morning to borrow flour. She must have tidied up, must have thrown it away thinking it was just scrap paper. Their neighbour, the well-meaning busybody who was always letting herself into Margaret's house, always trying to help in ways that created more problems than they solved. "I wrote you everything," Sarah said, her own tears flowing now. "Told you I loved you, told you I'd write from Missoula, told you I'd send money as soon as I found work. I never meant for you to wake up and find me just gone." Margaret pulled her daughter close, holding her tight. 3 weeks of fear and searching, all because of a letter that never reached its destination. Jacob sat quietly, giving them their moment. When Margaret finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, she looked at him with new understanding. "You saved her life," she said. "Twice. Once from the cold, and once from the fever." "I did what needed doing," Jacob said simply. "Same as anyone would." But Margaret knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have climbed down that ravine. Not everyone would have spent 3 days nursing a stranger through delirium. Not everyone would have opened their home and shared their supplies with a woman who had nothing to offer in return. She looked at the torn canvas on the table, at the evidence of violence that had nearly taken her daughter from her. Then she looked at the medicine bundle, at the evidence of care that had brought Sarah back from the edge of death. "The blizzard," Margaret said, her voice steadier now. "How long did it last?" 12 days, Jacob replied. "Worst storm I've seen in 8 years on this mountain. Snow came down so heavy you couldn't see 3 feet in front of your face. Drifts piled up higher than the cabin walls. Even if I'd wanted to try for town, we would have died in the first mile." Sarah nodded. "I remember looking out the window, seeing nothing but white. It felt like we were the only people left in the world." "And when the storm finally cleared?" Margaret asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "By then she'd been here 2 weeks, Jacob said. 2 weeks of an unmarried woman living alone with a man. By frontier standards, that was enough to ruin her reputation, marriage or not. But if we said we were married, if we made it legal and binding, then she could stay here without scandal, following her for the rest of her life." Margaret understood the harsh mathematics of frontier propriety, the way a woman's value could be destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. "So you married her," Margaret said. "So I offered," Jacob corrected. "And she accepted. We spoke our vows before God, with no witness but the mountains and the sky. I carved her a ring from pine wood. It's not much, but it's honest." Margaret looked at the wooden band on her daughter's finger, at the simple craftsmanship that spoke of care and patience. It wasn't what she'd imagined for Sarah. No church ceremony, no white dress, no celebration with family and friends. But it was real. It was binding. And it had given her daughter a future when all other options had been burned away by violence and chance. "Show me where you found her," Margaret said suddenly. "I need to see it." Jacob exchanged a glance with Sarah, then nodded. "The trail will be hard, but if the weather holds, we can make it there and back before dark." Margaret stood, her decision made. She needed to see the place where her daughter had nearly died, needed to understand, in her bones, how close she'd come to losing Sarah forever. Only then could she begin to accept what had happened in this remote cabin on the mountain. Only then could she decide whether to forgive them both for the choices they had made without her. Morning came cold and bright, sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows and turning the frost on the glass into patterns of crystalline beauty. Margaret woke to find Sarah already up, tending the fire and preparing breakfast. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. "Mama," Sarah said, noticing her mother stirring. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Margaret admitted, though her back ached from sleeping in the chair. She was too old for such accommodations, but she'd refused to take the bed from her daughter. Jacob came in from the barn, carrying fresh eggs in his hat. He'd clearly been up for hours already. His face was ruddy from the cold, and there was snow on his boots from whatever morning chores he'd completed. "Weather's holding," he announced, setting the eggs carefully on the table. "If it stays clear, I'll take a ride into the lower country this afternoon, check the trapline." Margaret watched as Sarah moved to take the eggs, her movements synchronized with Jacob's, as if they'd been doing this dance for years rather than weeks. There was an ease between them that spoke of growing familiarity, of two people learning to share space without friction. After breakfast, Jacob excused himself to work on repairing a section of the barn roof. Sarah cleared the dishes, and Margaret rose to help her. But as Sarah worked, Margaret noticed her daughter's hands trembling slightly. "What is it?" Margaret asked, moving closer. Sarah set down the plate she'd been washing and turned to face her mother. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said quietly, glancing toward the door to make sure Jacob was out of earshot. "Something I haven't told anyone. Not even Jacob." Margaret's heart clenched. "What is it, child?" Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, Margaret saw a silver locket, the one Margaret had given Sarah on her 16th birthday, the one that contained a tiny portrait of Margaret and her late husband, painted in miniature by a traveling artist who'd passed through Helena years ago. "I thought I'd lost this in the attack," Sarah whispered, her thumb tracing the locket's engraved surface. "But I found it yesterday, tucked in the lining of my skirt pocket. I'd forgotten I put it there." Margaret took the locket, opening it to see the familiar faces looking back at her. Her younger self, before grief had carved lines around her eyes. Her husband, strong and smiling, his hand on her shoulder. "Why haven't you shown this to Jacob?" Margaret asked. Sarah's tears finally spilled over. "Because when I look at it, I remember why I left Helena. I remember sitting in our tiny room, looking at Papa's face, and thinking about how he'd worked himself to death, trying to provide for us. How you'd worked your fingers to the bone, sewing other people's dresses while wearing rags yourself." She sank into a chair, her voice breaking. "I remember feeling like such a burden, Mama. Like I was just another mouth to feed. Another person taking from you when you had nothing left to give. I thought if I left, if I found work in Missoula, I could finally stop being the reason you suffered." Margaret knelt beside her daughter's chair, taking Sarah's hands in her own. "Oh, my darling girl, you were never a burden. Never. You were the reason I kept going after your father died. You were my purpose, my joy." "But I saw how you looked at me sometimes," Sarah said, her voice small. "Like you were afraid. Like you knew there was no future for me and Helena. No good man who would marry a seamstress's daughter with no dowry. I saw you worrying about what would happen to me after you were gone." Margaret couldn't deny it. Those fears had haunted her late at night, when the sewing was done, and the lamp oil was running low, and she counted their meager savings for the 100th time. "I did worry," Margaret admitted, "but not because you were a burden. I worried because I loved you and wanted better for you than the life I could provide. And now I have better," Sarah said, gesturing around the cabin. "I have land, security, a husband who treats me with respect. I have a future, Mama. But it means accepting that I can never go back to who I was in Helena. That girl is gone. Margaret understood then what her daughter was really saying. Sarah hadn't just survived the attack on the wagon train. She'd been reborn in this cabin, forged into someone new by the fire of necessity and the steady hand of a man who'd given her a second chance at life. "Do you miss her?" Margaret asked softly. "That girl you were?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the locket in her mother's hands. "Sometimes," she admitted. She was softer, more innocent. She believed in fairy tales and happy endings. She looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. But she was also weak. She couldn't have survived what I've survived. She couldn't have made the hard choices I've had to make. And you think those choices were right? I think they were necessary, Sarah said, and I think I'm stronger for having made them. When I married Jacob, when I stood before God and spoke those vows, I wasn't thinking about love or romance. I was thinking about survival, about building something that would last. Is that wrong? Margaret thought about her own marriage, about the practical considerations that had gone into it alongside the affection. Her husband had been a good man, but he'd also been a stable man with a trade and prospects. Love had grown from that foundation, not the other way around. "No," Margaret said finally. "It's not wrong. It's realistic. And maybe that's a kind of wisdom that girl in Helena never had." Sarah smiled through her tears. "You taught me that wisdom, Mama. You taught me that survival matters more than dreams, that practical love outlasts passionate love, that the strongest bonds are built on respect and partnership. I taught you that?" "Every day," Sarah said. "Every time you patched our clothes one more time instead of buying new. Every time you took in extra sewing even though your hands ached. Every time you smiled and told me everything would be all right, even when I knew you were afraid. You taught me how to be strong." Margaret pulled her daughter into an embrace, holding her tight as Sarah cried against her shoulder. All the fear and anger that had driven Margaret up this mountain began to dissolve, replaced by a fierce pride in the woman her daughter had become. When Sarah finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, Margaret pressed the locket into her hand. "Keep this," Margaret said. "Not to remember who you were, but to remember where you came from. You may be someone new now, but you're still my daughter. You're still the girl who carries her father's courage and her mother's stubbornness." Sarah laughed, clutching the locket to her chest. "Is that what you call it? Stubbornness? What else would you call riding 3 weeks through winter mountains to find your missing daughter?" "Love," Sarah said simply. "I'd call it love." They sat together in the morning light, mother and daughter, bound by blood and history and the fierce determination that had carried them both through their darkest hours. Outside, they could hear Jacob working on the barn roof, the steady rhythm of his hammer marking time. "He's teaching me to read the stars," Sarah said after a while. "Says that way I'll never be lost, no matter where I am." "That's a good skill to have," Margaret agreed. "He's patient when he teaches," Sarah continued, her voice soft. "Never makes me feel stupid for not knowing something. Just shows me again and again until I understand." She paused, then added, "I think he'd make a good father someday." The implications of that statement hung in the air between them. Children, grandchildren, a future that extended beyond mere survival into something resembling a real life. "Do you want children?" Margaret asked carefully. "Someday," Sarah said, "when we're more settled, when the cabin addition is built and we have more supplies stored. Jacob says we should wait at least a year, make sure we can provide properly." She smiled. He's cautious that way. Thinks everything through. That's not a bad quality in a husband, Margaret observed. No, Sarah agreed. It's not. Jacob's hammer fell silent. A moment later, the cabin door opened, and he stepped inside, brushing sawdust from his shirt. I've got the roof patched, he announced. Should hold through the rest of winter. He noticed the two women sitting close together, saw the locket in Sarah's hand, and seemed to understand he'd interrupted something important. I can go back out if you need more time. No, Sarah said, standing up and tucking the locket back into her pocket. Stay. Mama and I were just talking about the future. Jacob looked between them, reading something in their faces that made him relax slightly. Good talk, I hope. Very good, Margaret said, rising from her chair. In fact, I think it's time I made myself useful around here. Sarah, why don't you teach me how you've been managing the household? I'd like to learn your routines. Sarah's face brightened with understanding and gratitude. Her mother was accepting this new life, was choosing to be part of it, rather than fighting against it. I'd like that, Sarah said. I'd like that very much. And as the three of them moved through the cabin, Sarah showing her mother where things were kept, Jacob adding wood to the fire and preparing to head out to check his trapline, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in 3 weeks. She felt hope. Not for a return to the past, but for a future that might actually be worth building. A future where her daughter could be safe, could be strong, could be exactly who she needed to be. Jacob left for his trapline check shortly after noon, promising to return before dark. Margaret watched from the window as he rode down the trail, his rifle slung across his back and his movements easy in the saddle. He was a man comfortable in his solitude, yet he'd opened his life to Sarah without hesitation when circumstance demanded it. He'll be fine, Sarah said, coming to stand beside her mother. He knows these mountains better than anyone. How often does he go out alone like this? Once a week, usually. He checks the traps, looks for game, makes sure no one's camping too close to the property. Says it's important to know what's happening on your own land. Margaret turned from the window to look at her daughter properly. In the clear daylight, she could see the changes more clearly. Sarah's hands were rougher, calloused from work. Her posture was straighter, more confident. Even her voice had changed, less hesitant, more sure. You've adapted well to this life, Margaret observed. Sarah shrugged. I didn't have much choice, but I think maybe I was suited for it in ways I never knew back in Helena. There's something about the frontier that strips away all the pretense, all the social rules that never made sense anyway. Here, you're judged by what you can do, not who your family is or how much money you have. Is that what you tell yourself? Margaret asked gently. That you chose this? I did choose it, Mamma. Maybe not the circumstances that brought me here, but I chose to stay. I chose to marry Jacob. I chose this life. Sarah moved to the table and began kneading bread dough she'd left rising earlier, and I'm not sorry for it. Margaret joined her daughter at the table, watching her work. Teach me to make bread your way. I want to learn. Sarah's hands stilled for a moment, surprise flickering across her face. Then she smiled and moved aside, making room for her mother at the table. You have to be patient with it, Sarah said, guiding Margaret's hands. The dough will tell you when it's ready. See how it springs back when you press it? That means it's had enough kneading. They worked together in comfortable silence, their hands moving in rhythm. Margaret found herself relaxing into the simple, repetitive motion. There was something meditative about it, something that quieted the constant worry that had plagued her for weeks. Jacob has a document, Margaret said after a while. A land deed. He showed it to me. The homestead claim, Sarah nodded. 160 acres. We have to improve the land for 5 years, then it's ours free and clear. No rent, no landlord, no one who can take it away. That's more security than I ever had in Helena, Margaret admitted. I know, Sarah said quietly. That's what I tried to tell you in the letter you never got. I wasn't running away from you, Mama. I was running toward something better, something stable. Margaret shaped the dough into a loaf, her hands working automatically while her mind wandered to the future. What will you do with all this land? Jacob wants to expand the garden come spring, plant more vegetables, maybe some corn if the growing season is long enough. He's talked about getting more cattle, building proper fences. Eventually, if things go well, maybe even opening a small trading post for trappers passing through. Sarah's eyes brightened as she talked, her excitement palpable. We could build something real here, Mama. Something that lasts. We, Margaret repeated. You keep saying we. Sarah looked at her mother, understanding dawning. I mean Jacob and me. But, Mama, I also mean you, if you want. If you'd consider staying. The offer hung in the air between them. Margaret hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead, too focused on understanding the present to contemplate the future. But now, standing in this cabin with flour on her hands and her daughter beside her, she felt the possibility of it settling into her bones. I have nothing to go back to, Margaret said softly. My house burned. My business is gone. Even if I returned to Helena, I'd be starting over with nothing. Then don't go back, Sarah said simply. Stay here. Help us build this place. You're strong, Mama, and you know things Jacob and I don't. How to preserve food properly, how to make clothes that last, how to manage a household. We need you. Sarah, I need you, Sarah corrected, her voice fierce. I thought I could do this alone. Thought I had to be independent and strong and never need anyone. But these past weeks, missing you, wondering if you were angry or hurt, or thinking I didn't love you, it's been the hardest part of all of this. Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. I'm here now, but will you stay? Before Margaret could answer, they heard hoofbeats approaching. Too fast, too urgent. Both women looked at each other, alarm flashing between them. Jacob wouldn't ride like that, unless something was wrong. Sarah grabbed the rifle from beside the door, checking quickly that it was loaded. Margaret was impressed by her daughter's swift, competent movements. The girl from Helena would have frozen in fear. This young woman moved with purpose and readiness. The hoofbeats stopped outside. A man's voice called out, "Hello, the cabin. I'm not armed. I need help." Sarah moved to the window, peering out carefully. It's one of the men from the wagon train, she said, her voice tense. I recognize him. He was driving the supply wagon. Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. Why would someone from the attack return now, weeks later? Sarah opened the door cautiously, the rifle still in her hands, but pointed at the ground. Mr. Hendricks! The man stumbled into view, and Margaret gasped. His face was battered, one eye swollen shut, his clothes torn and bloody. He clutched his left arm close to his body, and even from across the room, Margaret could see the awkward angle of it. Mrs. Stone, he corrected himself, remembering Sarah's married status. Thank God. I didn't know where else to go. The Garrett gang, they came back. They're looking for survivors from the ambush. They're looking for anyone who might have seen their faces. Sarah's hands tightened on the rifle. How did they know to come looking? Someone in Coopersville must have talked. They've been asking around about the wagon train, about who survived. I tried to run, but they caught me, beat me, wanted to know if there were other witnesses. He swayed on his feet, his face pale with pain and blood loss. I didn't tell them about you. I swore there were no other survivors. But I don't know if they believed me. Margaret's world tilted. The danger she'd worried about abstractly was suddenly concrete and immediate. The men who'd tried to kill her daughter once might be coming back to finish the job. "How far behind you are they?" Sarah asked, her voice remarkably steady. "I don't know. Half a day, maybe less. I stole a horse from their camp and rode as hard as I could." Hendricks finally collapsed, falling to his knees. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've led them right to you." Sarah looked at her mother, and in that moment, Margaret saw not fear, but determination in her daughter's eyes. "We need to get him inside and tend to his wounds. Then we need to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "For whatever comes," Sarah said grimly. "And we need to hope Jacob gets back before they do." She helped Hendricks into the cabin, and Margaret rushed to gather clean cloth and water. As she worked, her hands shaking slightly, she realized that the peaceful future she'd been imagining just moments ago had been shattered by cold reality. The Garrett gang was coming, and Jacob was out on the trap line, miles away, with no idea his wife and her mother were about to face the same men who'd already tried to kill Sarah once. Margaret looked at her daughter, saw the set of her jaw, the way she held the rifle like she knew how to use it. Sarah had survived the attack before, and she would fight to survive again. The only question was whether that would be enough. Margaret worked quickly to clean and bandage Hendricks's wounds while Sarah barred the door and closed the shutters. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, darker, more like a trap than a refuge. Hendricks's arm was broken badly. Margaret could feel the bone grinding beneath her fingers as she wrapped it as tightly as she dared. "This needs a doctor," she said quietly. "No time," Hendricks gasped through clenched teeth. "They'll be here soon. You need to run, both of you. Take the horses and head north, deeper into the mountains where they can't follow." "We can't leave you here like this," Sarah said, checking the rifle's ammunition. "And we can't run. If they've been asking about survivors, they'll just keep hunting until they find us. Running only delays the inevitable." Margaret looked at her daughter with new eyes. When had Sarah become so pragmatic, so tactical? This was not the soft-hearted girl who'd left Helena. This was someone who'd learned to think like a survivor. "Then what do you suggest?" Margaret asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Sarah moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. "Jacob taught me something about defense. He said a cabin like this is a fortress if you use it right. Small windows, solid walls, only one door. A few people inside can hold off a larger force if they're smart about it." "But we're not soldiers," Margaret protested. "We're 2 women and an injured man." "We're 3 people with guns and a defensible position," Sarah corrected. "That's more than most folks have when trouble comes calling." She moved to the corner of the cabin and pulled up a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a small cache of supplies, ammunition, another rifle, 2 pistols, and several boxes of cartridges. Margaret stared in amazement. "Jacob prepared for this?" she asked. "Jacob prepares for everything," Sarah said, distributing the weapons. She handed a pistol to Margaret. "You said you know how to shoot. Time to prove it." Margaret took the weapon, feeling its weight in her hand. She'd fired her husband's pistol a few times at targets behind their house in Helena, but she'd never pointed a gun at another human being. The thought of it made her hands shake. "Mama," Sarah said gently, placing her hand over her mother's. "I need you strong right now. Can you do that for me?" Margaret looked into her daughter's eyes and saw the plea there, not for rescue, but for partnership. Sarah needed her mother to be a fighter, not a liability. "Yes," Margaret said, steadying herself. "Yes, I can do that." A sound from outside made them all freeze. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving at a walking pace. Sarah crept to the window and peered out, her face going pale. "4 riders," she whispered. "Same men from the wanted poster." Hendricks groaned, trying to sit up. "I'm sorry. I thought I'd lost them." "Stay quiet," Sarah ordered. She positioned herself by the window with the rifle, while Margaret took up a spot by the door with her pistol. Maybe they'll ride past. But the hoofbeats stopped right outside the cabin. A man's voice called out, rough and mocking. "We know you're in there, Hendricks. Saw the blood trail you left. Now you can come out easy, or we can come in and drag you out. Your choice." Sarah and Margaret exchanged glances. The voice was confident, arrogant, the voice of a man who believed he held all the power. "What do we do?" Margaret whispered. Before Sarah could answer, another voice called out. This one different, harder to place. "Hendricks ain't alone in there, Ray. Look at the smoke from the chimney, the curtains in the windows. Someone's been living here." There was a pause, then the first voice again, now more interested. "Well, now that's interesting. Who else you got in there with you, Hendricks? The homesteader who owns this place?" Sarah's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "They don't know," she breathed. "They don't know about me. They think Jacob is the one harboring Hendricks." A plan formed in Margaret's mind, desperate and dangerous, but possibly their only chance. "Then let's keep it that way," she said quietly. "Sarah, how well can you imitate Jacob's voice? Not well enough to fool them up close. Then don't get close." Margaret moved to Sarah's side, speaking quickly. "They're expecting a man. Let them keep expecting one. Buy us time until Jacob actually gets back." Sarah understood immediately. She moved to the door and called out in the deepest voice she could manage, "This is private property. You have no business here." A laugh from outside. "That so? Well, private property or not, we got business with the man bleeding all over your floor. Send him out, and we'll be on our way." "He's injured and can't travel," Sarah called back, maintaining her rough approximation of a man's voice. "Leave him be, and there'll be no trouble." "Already is trouble, friend. See, Mr. Hendricks here saw our faces during a little misunderstanding a few weeks back. Can't have witnesses running around talking to marshals, you understand. Bad for business." Sarah looked at her mother, then at Hendricks. The teamster's face was grey with pain and fear, but he shook his head firmly. "Don't give me up," he rasped. "They'll kill you all anyway once they have me." Margaret knew he was right. Men like the Garrett gang didn't leave witnesses. Ever. The voice outside came again, now with an edge of impatience. "Tell you what, friend. You send out Hendricks, and we'll give you something for your trouble. Say, $50 for your inconvenience." Sarah didn't respond. Margaret could see her daughter's mind working, calculating angles and possibilities. "No? How about 100? Still silence from inside. "You're starting to annoy me," the voice said, anger creeping in. "Last chance. Send him out or we come in and take him, and anyone who gets in our way gets hurt." Margaret's grip tightened on her pistol. This was it. The moment when everything would change. She thought of her life in Helena, of the quiet years sewing and raising her daughter and trying to maintain respectability. How far she'd come from that world, how different the choices had become. Sarah met her mother's eyes, a silent question passing between them. "Are you ready?" Margaret nodded, ready as she'd ever be. But before Sarah could respond to the threat, they heard something that changed everything. The sound of a rifle being cocked, and a new voice, hard as iron and cold as winter. "I'm the homesteader who owns this property, and you men are trespassing." "Jacob." He'd come back. Margaret risked a glance through the shutter crack and saw him standing at the tree line, maybe 40 yards from the cabin. His rifle was raised and aimed, and even from this distance, she could see the deadly calm in his posture. The 4 riders wheeled their horses to face this new threat. The one called Ray, the leader with the scar across his cheek, assessed Jacob with the practiced eye of a man who'd sized up many opponents. "Well now," Ray said slowly. "The homesteader himself. You picked a bad time to come home, friend." "I don't consider you a friend," Jacob replied, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "And I suggest you ride out now, while you still can." One of the other riders laughed. 4 against 1, old man. Even a mountain hermit should be able to count that high. 3 against 4, Jacob corrected calmly. "I got 2 rifles aimed at you from inside that cabin, and I guarantee you, the person holding them can shoot better than you think." Margaret saw Sarah raise her rifle, tracking one of the riders through the window crack. Her daughter's hands were steady, her breathing controlled. Jacob had taught her well. Ray's eyes narrowed, reassessing the situation. 4 against 3 wasn't the odds he'd wanted, especially when one of those 3 had already demonstrated he knew how to handle himself by getting the drop on them. "You're bluffing," Ray said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Jacob's rifle never wavered. "Only one way to find out. But I'll tell you this. First man who draws is the first man who dies. And I promise you, it won't be me." The standoff stretched out, tension thick enough to cut. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the pistol in her hand. Through the crack in the shutter, she watched Jacob, absolutely still, absolutely focused. This was a different side of him, one she hadn't seen before. Not the gentle homesteader or the patient teacher, but something older and harder. A man who'd survived war and wilderness and loss. A man who would not hesitate to kill, protect what was his. Ray must have seen it too, because his posture shifted slightly. "This ain't over," he said, but he was already pulling his horse's head around. "You're harboring a witness. That makes you an enemy of the Garrett gang, and we don't forget our enemies." "I'll remember that," Jacob said flatly. "Now get off my land." The 4 riders backed their horses away, maintaining eye contact with Jacob until they reached the tree line. Then they turned and rode off, not quite running, but moving faster than a casual pace. Jacob didn't lower his rifle until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then he walked quickly to the cabin door, knocking sharply. "Sarah, it's me. Open up." Sarah threw back the bar and yanked open the door. Jacob stepped inside, his eyes immediately sweeping the cabin, taking in Hendrix's condition, the weapons in the women's hands, the defensive positions they'd taken. "You did good," he said simply, then turned to Hendrix. "How badly are you hurt?" "Broken arm, some ribs maybe. Lost some blood." Hendrix tried to sit up straighter. "I'm sorry, Stone. I didn't mean to bring them here. I didn't know where else to go." "You did right," Jacob said, already moving to examine the injuries. He glanced at Margaret. "You're bandaging?" "Yes." "Good work. Clean and tight. He'll live." Jacob looked back at Hendrix. "But we've got a bigger problem now. Ray Garrett doesn't make idle threats. If he said this isn't over, he meant it. They'll be back, probably with more men." Sarah set down her rifle, her face pale but composed. Then what do we do? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of difficult choices. We have two options. We run, pack up what we can carry, abandon the homestead, and head for the nearest settlement with a marshal. Or we stay and fight, and hope we can hold them off long enough for help to arrive. If we run, we lose everything, Sarah said. 5 years of work gone, the land claim forfeited. We'd have to start over with nothing. If we stay, we might not live to see those 5 years completed, Jacob countered. The Garrett gang has killed before. They'll kill again without hesitation. Margaret listened to them discuss their options, these two people who'd built something fragile and precious on this mountain. She thought of Sarah's words earlier, about building something that lasts, about having security and a future, and she thought about her own life, about always running from trouble, always choosing survival over standing ground. It had kept her alive, but it had also cost her everything she'd tried to build. I vote we stay, Margaret said quietly. Both Jacob and Sarah turned to look at her in surprise. Mama, Sarah began. No, Margaret said firmly. Listen to me. I've spent my whole life running. Running from poverty, running from scandal, running from anything that threatened what little I had. And in the end, I lost it all anyway. My home burned. My business is gone. All that running, and I ended up with nothing. She looked at her daughter, then at Jacob. But you two have something here. Something real and solid and worth protecting. If we run now, you'll spend the rest of your lives wondering if they'll find you again. If you made the right choice. If you're truly safe anywhere. She straightened her shoulders. I'd rather make a stand. At least then we'll know. Jacob studied her for a long moment, respect growing in his eyes. You understand what you're saying? We'll be outnumbered. The odds aren't good. The odds haven't been good since my husband died, Margaret replied. But I'm still here, and so is my daughter. We're survivors, Mr. Stone, all three of us. Maybe it's time we stop just surviving and start fighting for something worth keeping. Sarah moved to her mother's side, taking her hand. Together, she said softly. Jacob nodded slowly. Together. Then we'd better start preparing. They'll come back at dawn, when the light is behind them, and we can't see as clearly to shoot. That gives us tonight to get ready. As the sun set over the mountain, painting the snow in shades of orange and red, the three of them, and the wounded Hendricks, began to prepare for the battle that would determine everything. Margaret had thought coming to this cabin would answer her questions about her daughter's choices. Instead, it had given her a choice of her own. And for the first time in years, she'd chosen to stand and fight. Night fell quickly in the mountains, darkness settling over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Jacob worked by lamplight, his movements efficient and purposeful as he prepared their defenses. Margaret watched him, understanding now why Sarah had trusted this man with her life. Everything he did was considered, practical, aimed at their survival. First thing we need is visibility, Jacob said, positioning Margaret and Sarah by different windows. They'll try to approach under cover of darkness, test our defenses. We need to know where they are at all times. He'd built up the fire until it roared in the hearth, making the cabin warm and bright. Margaret started to protest the waste of wood, but Jacob shook his head. We want it bright in here, he explained. Makes it harder for anyone outside to see in through the windows. But we can still see out into the darkness. Old military trick. You were a soldier, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. In another life, Jacob replied, not elaborating. He moved to the trunk in the corner and pulled out additional supplies, more ammunition, 2 lanterns filled with oil, a coil of rope, and several small pouches that clinked when he set them down. Sarah recognized them. "The bells from your trapline." "We're going to set a perimeter," Jacob said. "String rope between the trees about 30 yards out. Hang the bells at intervals. Anyone trying to sneak up on the cabin will hit the rope and set off the bells. It won't stop them, but it'll give us warning." "I'll help," Sarah said, already reaching for her coat. "No," Jacob said firmly. "Too dangerous. They might have someone watching the cabin already." "Then how will you—" "I'll go out the back window. Stay low. Use the terrain for cover. I know every rock and tree on this property." They don't. He looked at Margaret and Sarah, his expression grave. "While I'm out there, you two keep watch. Hendricks, can you hold a rifle with that arm?" The teamster, propped up against the wall with blankets, nodded weakly. "Not well, but I can manage if it comes to it." "It might," Jacob said. He pulled Sarah aside, speaking quietly, but not so quietly that Margaret couldn't hear. "If something happens to me out there, you bar that back window the moment you hear gunfire. You and your mother hold this cabin until dawn, then you take the horses and ride for Coopersville. Don't stop for anything. Understand?" Sarah's face went pale. "Jacob, do you understand?" he repeated, his voice gentle but unyielding. "Yes," Sarah whispered. He touched her face briefly, a rare gesture of affection from a man who showed his care through actions rather than words. Then he turned to the back window, opened it silently, and slipped out into the darkness. Margaret moved to Sarah's side as they watched the shadows where Jacob had disappeared. "He knows what he's doing," Margaret said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I know," Sarah replied, "but that doesn't make it easier." They waited in tense silence, listening to every sound from outside. The wind in the trees, the distant cry of a night bird, the creak of the cabin settling. Every noise made Margaret's heart jump, her hand tightening on the pistol. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Margaret found herself praying, something she hadn't done much since her husband died. She prayed for Jacob's safety, for Sarah's strength, for her own courage not to fail when the moment came. A soft whistle from outside, 3 short notes. Sarah relaxed slightly. "That's Jacob's signal. He's coming back." Moments later, Jacob appeared at the back window, climbing in silently. His hands were cold when he brushed past Margaret, and there were pine needles stuck to his coat. "It's done," he said. "Perimeter is set on 3 sides. The 4th side backs up against the ravine, too steep to climb. If they come, we'll hear them." "If?" Margaret asked. "When?" Jacob corrected himself. "Ray Garrett isn't the type to let an insult stand. He'll be back. Probably before dawn." He moved to the fireplace and pulled down the wedding quilt that had belonged to his late wife, Emma. Margaret watched in confusion as he began cutting it into strips with his hunting knife. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, distress in her voice. "Making bandages," Jacob said simply. "If shooting starts, someone's likely to get hurt. We need to be prepared." Sarah reached out to stop him, her hand closing over his. "That was Emma's. You've kept it all these years." Jacob looked at the quilt, and something passed across his face. Grief, acceptance, a kind of weary resolve. "Emma would understand," he said quietly. "The living matter more than the dead. She'd want us to survive." He continued cutting, transforming the beautiful quilt into practical supplies. Margaret felt the weight of the sacrifice, understanding what it meant for Jacob to destroy this last piece of his first marriage to protect his second. Sarah sat down beside him, taking up some of the strips and rolling them into tight bundles. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "About Emma." Jacob's hands paused in their work. Why now? Because I'm wearing her husband's ring, sleeping in her home, living the life that should have been hers. And because if tomorrow goes badly, I want to know who came before me. Jacob was quiet for so long, Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. But then he began to speak, his voice low and distant with memory. She was young when we married. 17, I was 22, working as a scout for the wagon trains coming west. She was the daughter of a farmer, had never been more than 10 miles from her home. But she had spirit, wanted to see the world, wanted adventure. He smiled slightly. Got more than she bargained for, marrying me. Did she love the frontier? Sarah asked. She loved the idea of it more than the reality, Jacob admitted. The loneliness got to her sometimes, the endless work, the way everything was so hard out here, so unforgiving, but she never complained. She'd made her choice, and she honored it. Like me, Sarah said. Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her. You're stronger than she was. Emma had a soft heart. It's what I loved about her, but it's also what made the frontier so hard for her. You have steel in you, Sarah. You can bend without breaking. I learned that from my mother, Sarah said, glancing at Margaret. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes but forced them back. This wasn't the time for sentiment. This was the time for strength. Emma was 8 months pregnant when the labor started, Jacob continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. Too early, the midwife said. But babies don't wait for convenient timing. She labored for 2 days. Fought so hard. But the baby was turned wrong, and there wasn't anything anyone could do. He set down the quilt strips, his hands shaking slightly. I buried them on the hill overlooking the valley. Promised them I'd make this land into something worthy of their sacrifice. Spent 8 years keeping that promise, building this place, making it secure and productive, and his voice broke. And then you came, Sarah, and I had to decide whether to lock my heart away forever or risk caring about someone again. Sarah took his hand, holding it tight. I'm glad you chose to care. So am I, Jacob said. Even if tomorrow brings trouble, even if this is all we get, I'm glad. Margaret watched them together, this unlikely couple bound by necessity, but growing into something genuine. She thought of the wooden ring on Sarah's finger, carved from pine, because there was nothing else available. How it symbolized everything about their relationship. Simple, practical, but crafted with care and meant to last. The night deepened. They took turns keeping watch, 2 people awake at all times while the third rested. Margaret took the first watch with Jacob, both of them stationed at windows facing different directions. You raised a good daughter, Jacob said quietly, his eyes scanning the darkness. She raised herself, mostly, Margaret replied. After her father died, I was so focused on keeping us fed and housed that I didn't have time to teach her much beyond basic survival. That's the most important lesson there is, Jacob said. Everything else is just details. They were quiet for a while. Then Margaret asked, What will you do if we survive this? Will you stay here, or will you think about moving somewhere safer? This land is mine, Jacob said simply. I've proved it up fair and square, built everything here with my own hands. I won't be run off by outlaws who think they can take what isn't theirs. If we survive tomorrow, I'll petition the territorial marshal for help tracking down the Garrett gang. Make sure they can't threaten anyone else. And if we don't survive? Jacob looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Then at least we went down fighting for something that mattered. That's more than most people can say. Margaret thought about that, about the difference between survival and having something worth surviving for. She'd spent so many years just trying to get by, to keep her head above water, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to fight for something bigger than immediate necessity. But here, in this cabin with these people, she remembered. Around midnight, one of the bells rang, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the quiet. Everyone came instantly alert, weapons raised, eyes fixed on the windows. They waited, barely breathing. Another bell rang, then another, tracing a path around the cabin's perimeter. "They're testing us," Jacob murmured. "Seeing how we react, where we're positioned. Don't shoot unless you have a clear target. We can't waste ammunition on shadows." The bells continued their eerie chorus for several minutes, then fell silent. No one emerged from the trees. No shots were fired, but the message was clear. "We know you're awake. We know you're armed, and we're coming anyway." "Get some rest," Jacob told Sarah and Margaret. "Both of you. I'll keep watch until dawn." "I'll stay with you," Margaret said firmly. "You can't stay awake all night and fight in the morning. We'll take shifts, 2 hours each." Jacob looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded. "2 hours, then. Wake me if anything changes." Sarah lay down on the bed, though Margaret doubted she'd sleep. Hendricks was already dozing fitfully by the fire, his face drawn with pain even in sleep. Margaret settled into her watch position, her pistol resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. She thought about the life she'd left behind in Helena, the small room above the dressmaker's shop, the endless hours bent over needle and thread, the constant worry about making rent. That life had burned away, and maybe that wasn't entirely a tragedy. Maybe it was a chance to build something new, something worth fighting for. The night wore on. Margaret counted the hours by the position of the stars through the window, by the way the moon tracked across the sky. She and Jacob traded watch shifts twice more before the first grey light of dawn began to brighten the eastern sky. "They'll come with the sunrise," Jacob said quietly, checking his rifle one last time. "When the light is behind them and in our eyes." "We're ready," Margaret said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Sarah woke, splashed cold water on her face, and took up her position by the window. Hendricks struggled to sit up, cradling his broken arm but gripping a pistol in his good hand. The four of them waited as the sky lightened, as the darkness gave way to dawn. Somewhere out in those trees, the Garrett gang was preparing their attack. But inside the cabin, 3 people who'd found each other through chance and necessity were preparing to defend what they'd built together. Margaret checked her pistol one more time, making sure it was loaded and ready. She thought of her daughter beside her, strong and capable. She thought of Jacob, calm and steady as stone. She thought of the future they might have if they survived this day, and she made peace with whatever was coming. The sun broke over the mountain, painting the snow in shades of gold and crimson, and in that beautiful, terrible light, the Garrett gang came riding out of the trees. The world narrowed to sound and smoke and the desperate need to keep shooting. Margaret fired again and again, her shots driving back the riders who tried to approach her window. She wasn't trying to kill, wasn't sure she could live with herself if she did, but she was making it costly for them to come close. From Jacob's position came the steady crack of rifle fire, each shot deliberate and aimed. He'd dropped one rider's horse, sending the man tumbling into the snow. The outlaw scrambled for cover, limping badly. Sarah's rifle barked twice in quick succession. Margaret heard a man cry out in pain, heard the sound of a body hitting the ground. Her daughter had drawn blood, and though Margaret's heart ached at what that might cost Sarah's soul, she was grateful for her daughter's strength. The riders wheeled away, regrouping at a distance. One man was down completely, not moving. Another was wounded, clutching his shoulder and swearing viciously. Ray Garrett's face was twisted with rage as he realized his easy victory wasn't materializing. "Reload," Jacob ordered, his voice cutting through the ringing in Margaret's ears. "Quick as you can. They'll try again." Margaret's hands shook as she fumbled with the ammunition, trying to remember the steps Jacob had taught her just hours ago. Sarah moved to help her mother, her own hands steady despite having just shot a man. "You're doing fine, Mama," Sarah said quietly. "Just keep them at a distance. That's all we need to do." Hendricks had managed to fire a few shots from his position despite his broken arm, though the recoil had clearly caused him agony. His face was grey with pain, but his eyes were fierce. "How much ammunition do we have left?" Margaret asked. Jacob didn't look away from the window. "Enough if we're careful. They can't keep this up forever either. Sooner or later, they'll have to decide if Hendricks is worth dying for." But Ray Garrett wasn't ready to give up. He'd dismounted now, and the remaining able riders were doing the same. They were going to try a ground assault, using the trees for cover, making themselves harder targets. "Smart," Jacob muttered. "Makes it harder for us to see them coming." The second assault came more slowly, more methodically. The outlaws advanced from tree to tree, laying down covering fire for each other, working their way closer to the cabin. Margaret could see the tactical intelligence behind it. This was how soldiers fought, not random bandits. "Ray Garrett was military," Jacob said, reading her thoughts. "Confederate cavalry, if I had to guess. He knows what he's doing." A bullet punched through the shutter near Margaret's head, showering her with splinters. She fired back blindly, heard Jacob snap at her to hold her fire. "Don't waste shots," he said. "Let them come closer if you have to. Make sure you can hit what you're aiming at." It went against every instinct to let the danger approach, but Margaret forced herself to wait, to breathe, to track the shadows moving through the trees. When she fired next, her shot was measured and true, sending an outlaw diving for cover. Sarah's rifle cracked again. "Got one in the leg," she reported, her voice clinical. "He's down but not out." They were winning, Margaret realized with a surge of hope. The outlaws were taking casualties while the defenders remained unharmed. Maybe Jacob's strategy of fortifying the cabin would actually work. But then everything changed. One of the outlaws had worked his way around to the barn, unseen in the chaos. He lit a torch. Margaret caught the flash of flame and hurled it onto the barn's roof. "No!" Jacob's voice was anguished. "The horses!" The barn wasn't as fire-resistant as the cabin. Within seconds, flames were licking up the wooden walls. The horses inside began to scream, a sound that cut through Margaret's chest like a knife. Jacob made a decision in an instant. "Sarah, take my position. Margaret, cover me. I have to get the horses out." "Jacob, no!" Sarah grabbed his arm. "It's too dangerous." "Those horses are our way out if we need to run. Without them, we're trapped here." He pulled away from her, heading for the door. "I'll be quick. Just keep them off me." He threw open the cabin door and ran for the barn, moving in a crouch. Margaret and Sarah fired frantically, trying to suppress the outlaws, trying to give Jacob the cover he needed. Ray Garrett saw the opportunity and took it. He rose from behind his cover and aimed carefully at Jacob's running form. Margaret saw it happening as if in slow motion. Saw Ray's finger tightening on the trigger. Saw Jacob still 20 feet from the barn, completely exposed. She didn't think. She stood, exposing herself in the window, and fired at Ray Garrett. Her bullet caught him in the side, spinning him around. His shot went wild, missing Jacob entirely. But another outlaw, seeing Margaret exposed, fired at her. Margaret felt something punch into her shoulder, hot and sharp. She staggered backward, the pistol falling from her nerveless fingers. "Mama!" Sarah's scream seemed to come from very far away. Margaret looked down and saw blood spreading across her dress, dark and wet. She tried to stay standing, but her legs wouldn't hold her. As she fell, she saw Jacob reach the barn, saw him throw open the doors and disappear into the smoke. Then Sarah was there, catching her mother, lowering her gently to the floor. Margaret could see tears streaming down her daughter's face, could feel Sarah's hands pressing against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "I'm all right," Margaret tried to say, though she wasn't sure the words came out properly. The battle continued around them, but Margaret's world had narrowed to her daughter's face above her, to the pressure of Sarah's hands trying to hold her together, to the strange detached feeling spreading through her limbs. She'd been shot. Actually shot. The reality of it seemed impossible, absurd. But the pain was real enough, and getting worse by the second. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the horses thundering out of the barn, heard Jacob's voice shouting something she couldn't make out. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky. Sarah was talking to her, saying something urgent and important, but Margaret couldn't quite focus on the words. Her mind was drifting, sliding away from the pain and chaos into something quieter. "Not yet," she told herself fiercely. "Not yet. Sarah needs me." She forced her eyes to focus, forced herself back to consciousness. Her daughter needed her strong, needed her to fight. So Margaret fought. She fought the darkness pulling at her, fought to stay present, fought to keep breathing. Around them, the battle for the cabin continued. But inside, mother and daughter clung to each other, refusing to let go. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through clean windows and the smell of pine and fresh bread. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her shoulder ached with a deep, persistent throb. Then it came back to her in pieces. The battle. Being shot. Sarah's face above hers, streaked with tears and smoke. The sounds of gunfire slowly fading as the outlaws retreated, their leader wounded, their numbers depleted, their will to fight broken. She was lying in the bed by the fire, covered with blankets and bandaged so thoroughly she could barely move her left arm. Sarah sat in a chair beside her, dozing with her head resting on the edge of the bed. "Sarah," Margaret whispered. Her daughter's eyes flew open, instantly alert. "Mama, you're awake. How do you feel?" "Like I've been shot," Margaret said, attempting a weak smile. "Which I suppose I have been." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I'd lost you. When you fell, when I saw all that blood." She couldn't finish. Margaret reached out with her good hand and took her daughter's fingers. "I'm here. I'm all right." "You saved Jacob's life," Sarah said. "Your shot hit Ray Garrett, threw off his aim. If you hadn't—" She swallowed hard. "You saved him, Mama. And then he saved you." "What happened?" Sarah settled back in her chair, but kept hold of her mother's hand. "After you were hit, Jacob got the horses out of the barn and came back. He shot the man who'd fired at you. Then he and Hendricks held them off while I worked on your wound." She managed a shaky smile. "You taught me well. I remembered everything you showed me about cleaning and bandaging injuries. The outlaws? They retreated after Ray went down. 2 of them were dead, 3 wounded, including Ray. They loaded up their casualties and rode off. Haven't seen them since. That was 3 days ago." Margaret blinked in surprise. 3 days? You've been in and out, fever from the wound. Jacob used his medicine bundle, made poultices and teas. Said you were strong, that you'd pull through. Sarah's voice wavered. He was right. Margaret looked around the cabin. Everything seemed normal, peaceful. The fire crackled in the hearth. Sunlight painted golden squares on the floor. Through the window, she could see the blackened remains of the barn. But even that was being rebuilt. Fresh timber was stacked nearby, and she could hear the sound of hammering from outside. "Jacob's building a new barn," Sarah explained. "Says it needs to be bigger anyway, now that we're staying." "We're staying," Margaret repeated, understanding what her daughter meant. Not just Sarah and Jacob, but all of them. The decision had been made, somewhere in the chaos of battle, sealed by blood and fear, and the simple fact that they'd fought for this place together. The door opened, and Jacob entered, carrying firewood. He saw Margaret awake, and his weathered face split into a rare smile. "About time you rejoined us," he said, setting down the wood and moving to her bedside. "You had us worried." "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "Didn't mean to cause trouble." "Trouble?" Jacob shook his head. "Woman, you saved my life and helped drive off the Garrett gang. I'd say that's the opposite of trouble." He checked her bandages with gentle hands, nodding approval at Sarah's work. "Healing clean. Another week and you'll be up and moving around. Just don't try to do too much too soon." "What about the gang? Will they come back?" Jacob's expression darkened slightly. "Possibly, but I doubt it. They lost too many men, and Ray Garrett is badly wounded. Word I sent to Coopersville 3 days ago. Marshals forming a posse to track them down. Between our testimony and Hendrix's, they'll hang for murder and robbery." He paused. "Your shot was good, Margaret. Very good." Margaret felt a complicated mix of emotions. She'd shot a man, had aimed to kill. That it was in defense of her family didn't make the weight of it any lighter. "I did what I had to," she said quietly. "We all did," Jacob agreed. "And now we get to keep living because of it." Over the next week, Margaret's strength slowly returned. She graduated from bed to chair to short walks around the cabin. Jacob had purchased a new family Bible in town, and one evening he presented it to her and Sarah. Inside the front cover, written in Jacob's careful script, were 3 names: Jacob Stone, Sarah Stone, and Margaret Hayes. Below that, he'd noted their marriage date and Margaret's arrival date, calling it her second beginning. Margaret traced the words with her finger, feeling the permanence of ink on paper. This was her family now, not by blood alone, but by choice and sacrifice. They'd fought together, bled together, survived together. Spring arrived gradually, melting the snow and revealing the brown earth beneath. The new barn rose timber by timber, larger than the old one. Margaret helped where she could, her injured shoulder healing slowly but surely. One afternoon, Jacob took them to the hillside overlooking the valley. 3 wooden crosses stood there, weathered but strong. Jacob had carved them during the long nights of winter, one for Emma and his stillborn son, one for Margaret's late husband, and now a third, blank for now, but waiting. "For whoever goes next," Jacob explained, "so none of us are alone up here." Margaret understood. They'd become a family forged by frontier necessity, bound by mutual respect and the simple determination to survive. Not the family any of them had planned, but perhaps the family they all needed. Sarah stood between her mother and her husband, one hand in each of theirs. The wooden ring on her finger caught the sunlight, glowing warm against her skin. She'd grown so much in the months since leaving Helena, stronger, more confident, more herself. "What do you think Papa would say?" Sarah asked softly. "About all of this?" Margaret thought about her late husband, about the dreams they'd had for their daughter. None of those dreams had included a remote mountain cabin and a marriage born of necessity. But looking at Sarah now, healthy and strong and genuinely content, Margaret knew the answer. "He'd say we did well," Margaret replied. "He'd say you found what matters most." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "A place to belong, people to love, land to call your own." Margaret smiled. A future built on more than just survival. They stood together on the hillside as the sun set over the valley, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and gold. Below them, smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, steady and sure. The new barn stood half-finished, a promise of continued growth and prosperity. Margaret thought about the woman she'd been when she climbed this mountain weeks ago, angry, frightened, determined to tear her daughter away from what she saw as a terrible mistake. How wrong she'd been, how much she'd misunderstood. Sarah hadn't lost her future on this mountain. She'd found it. And in finding her daughter, Margaret had found something unexpected for herself. A second chance at family, at purpose, at a life that meant more than just enduring until the end. "Come on," Jacob said, his voice warm. "Let's go home." Home. The word settled over Margaret like a blessing. Not the home she'd lost in Helena, but a new home built on this rugged land by people who refused to give up. They walked down the hillside together, three people who'd become a family through fire and fear, and the simple choice to stand together when it would have been easier to run. The wooden crosses stood sentinel on the hill, honoring the past while the living moved toward the future. And in the valley below, the cabin waited, small and sturdy and filled with the light of coming evening. A place of safety, a place of belonging, home.